This is the story of the one American warship that the enemy could never manage to kill, no matter how many times their radio broadcasts insisted the job was already done. Across 3 years of fighting in the Pacific, Japanese radio announced the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise sunk on 3 separate occasions, and every single time she was still afloat, still launching aircraft off her deck, and still climbing toward a distinction no other ship in her navy would ever hold. By the time the Second World War ended, Enterprise had earned 20 battle stars, which is 3 more than any other ship that has ever served under the American flag. That number becomes even harder to grasp once you look at who came second. The next closest ships in the entire fleet were 3 heavy cruisers, the New Orleans, the Minneapolis, and the San Francisco, and each of those earned 17. Drop down to the next carrier on the list, the Essex, and the total falls to 13. Enterprise did not simply lead her category, she stood a full 7 battle stars clear of every other aircraft carrier that fought the war. The Navy's own official history sums up the scale of what this ship accomplished in a single sentence. Of the more than 20 major actions fought across the entire Pacific War, Enterprise took part in all but 2. She rode out Pearl Harbor, turned the tide at Midway, and fought off Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, in the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf, over Iwo Jima, and off Okinawa, where a young pilot finally accomplished what 3 years of bombs, torpedoes, and propaganda broadcasts never could. Even then, she refused to sink. What follows is how a single ship earned 2 nicknames as different as the Big E and the Grey Ghost, how she became the last operational American carrier in the entire Pacific at the darkest point of 1942, and how her aircraft helped sink the 2 largest battleships ever built. It is also the story of how a ship that survived everything the Japanese Navy could throw at her was finally destroyed by something no enemy ever managed, a shortage of money and a decision made in peacetime. The beginning was not a battle at all, it was an act of Congress. On the 16th of June, 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, the United States authorized 2 new aircraft carriers using recovery funds meant to put the country back to work. The president set aside $238 million for new ships, and among them were 2 sisters of a brand new class, the Yorktown and the Enterprise, with a 3rd sister, the Hornet, to follow. These 3 fast carriers were designed to carry a large air group and to hurl American air power across the enormous distances of the Pacific. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia won the contract, and on the 16th of July, 1934, workers laid the keel of the 2nd ship in the class, the one that would carry the hull number CV6. She spent more than 2 years on the ways before the day finally came. On the 3rd of October, 1936, Enterprise slid into the water for the first time, christened by the wife of the Secretary of the Navy. Fitting her out took another year and a half, and on the 12th of May, 1938, at the Naval Operating Base in Norfolk, Enterprise entered commission with Captain Newton White as her first commanding officer. The machine that joined the fleet that day was formidable for its era. Enterprise displaced roughly 19,800 tons, stretched 809 feet from bow to stern, and carried a beam of just over 83 feet, widening to 114 feet across the flight deck. 9 boilers drove 4 sets of geared turbines and 4 shafts, delivering 120,000 shaft horsepower, and all that power pushed her to a top speed of 33 knots, fast enough to run with any carrier task force the Navy would ever build. Designed to operate around 80 aircraft, she commissioned, with 8 5-inch guns, a number that would grow enormously once the war taught its brutal lessons about attack from the air. Her crew is harder to pin to a single figure, and the sources do not fully agree, so it deserves to be stated plainly. The Navy's official ship dictionary lists a complement of 2,919, while other references put the figure closer to 2,200 officers and men for 1941. That gap almost certainly reflects the difference between a peacetime crew and a full wartime one, swollen by the air group and the gun crews, and it is a useful reminder that even the basic facts about a warship shift depending on which moment of her life you are describing. One point stays fixed. Enterprise ranked among the first American ships fitted with an early production radar set, a piece of technology that within a few short years would separate the living from the dead. She also arrived carrying names she had not yet earned. In time the crew and the public would call her the Big A, the Japanese would hand her the darker title of Grey Ghost, and along the way she collected others, the Lucky E, the Galloping Ghost. None of that existed in 1938. Back then she was simply a new carrier working up, cruising south to Rio de Janeiro on her shakedown, taking part in the fleet's great annual war game in the Caribbean the following year, and drawing Hollywood aboard in 1940 when Warner Brothers filmed parts of the movie dive bomber on her decks. That was the last time cameras pointed at Enterprise for any reason other than war. Now comes the first turn of fortune in a career defined by them. Late in November of 1941, Enterprise drew an assignment that would place her, by pure chance, in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. Her orders were to carry a squadron of Marine fighters out to Wake Island, reinforcing that lonely outpost against a war everyone could feel coming. She delivered those aircraft on the 2nd of December, 1941, then swung around and started home for Pearl Harbor. She was running late, because bad weather had slowed her return. That delay is one of the great what-ifs of the entire war. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, when the first Japanese aircraft came screaming in over the battleships moored along Ford Island, Enterprise was nowhere near her berth. She was still at sea, roughly 200 miles from Oahu, sailing as part of Task Force 8 under Vice Admiral William Halsey. Had the weather cooperated and put her back on schedule, Enterprise would have been tied up in harbor, a stationary target for the same torpedo bombers that gutted Battleship Row. Instead, she sat hundreds of miles out, and her aircraft flew straight into the attack. Enterprise had launched a group of Dauntless scout bombers ahead of the ship that morning to sweep the waters around Oahu and then land at Pearl, and they arrived over the island in the middle of the raid, trapped between Japanese fighters and American anti-aircraft gunners who by then were firing at anything with wings. The exact toll on those scouts is one of the small historical disputes that clings to this ship. The most detailed accounts hold that of 18 scout bombers, 7 were shot down, 8 airmen were killed, and 2 were wounded, while other sources give slightly different numbers and divide the losses differently between enemy fighters and friendly fire. The grim distinction is not in dispute. Enterprise was the only American carrier with men flying over Pearl Harbor during the attack, and those men were among the very first American casualties of the Pacific War. Running for cover was never in her nature. Within days she was hunting, and on the 10th of December, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, her aircraft found and sank the Japanese submarine I-70. That kill marked the first full-sized enemy warship destroyed by American forces in the Pacific War. The Grey Ghost had drawn first blood almost before the smoke over Pearl Harbor cleared. Through the opening months of 1942, the United States was losing nearly everywhere, with the Philippines falling and Wake overrun, and the public badly needed proof that the Navy could hit back. More than any other ship, Enterprise supplied that proof. On the 1st of February, 1942, she led the first American offensive strikes of the war against Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, a pinprick against a vast enemy perimeter, but a punch thrown all the same, and it mattered. Later that month she struck Wake Island, the very outpost she had reinforced before the war, and on the 4th of March she hit Marcus Island, driving American carrier aircraft closer to the Japanese home islands than they had ever flown. The raid that captured an entire nation's imagination came next, and Enterprise sat at the center of it even though her name is not the one most people remember. On the 18th of April, 1942, 16 Army B-25 bombers lifted off the deck of the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo, an operation history records as the Doolittle Raid. Hornet gets the credit as the ship that carried the bombers, and rightly so, but here is the part that usually goes missing. Hornet could not launch a single one of her own aircraft while the Army bombers jammed her flight deck, which left her blind and nearly defenseless. The ship guarding her was Enterprise. Flying as flagship of Task Force 16 under Halsey once again, Enterprise put up the combat air patrol and the scouting flights that shielded the whole operation. The task force that struck the heart of the Japanese Empire was built around 2 carriers, for cruisers, 8 destroyers, oilers, and submarines, roughly 10,000 men, and Enterprise was its shield. One story from the run-up to the war captures the spirit driving the ship in those early months. Sailing under war conditions before Pearl Harbor, Halsey is reported to have ordered his men to sink any shipping and shoot down any aircraft they encountered. When an officer asked who would answer for it if this touched off a war, Halsey supposedly replied that he would take the responsibility himself, and that if anything got in his way, They would shoot first and argue about it afterward. The precise wording is the kind of thing that gets polished in a retelling, so it belongs in quotation marks with some care, yet it fits the ship perfectly. From the very first week of the war, Enterprise was an aggressive weapon in aggressive hands. Everything Enterprise had done in those first 6 months was only prologue. In June of 1942, she fought the battle that turned the whole Pacific War, and her aircraft delivered the decisive killing blows. The Battle of Midway ran from the 4th to the 6th of June, 1942, and Enterprise sailed into it as part of Task Force 16, though Halsey was no longer in command. Hospitalized on the eve of the battle, he had handed the task force to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a surface officer with no aviation background who had proved to be one of the finest carrier commanders the Navy ever produced. The stakes could not have been higher, with a Japanese fleet built around 4 fleet carriers bearing down on Midway Atoll, hoping to draw out and annihilate what remained of American naval power in the Pacific. On the morning of the 4th of June, the American squadrons went in. The torpedo planes attacked first, flying obsolete aircraft low and slow into a wall of fighters and flak, and they were slaughtered, with Enterprise losing most of her own Torpedo 6 and its commander, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. That sacrifice bought something priceless. While enemy fighters were dragged down to wave-top height chasing the doomed torpedo planes, the American dive bombers arrived overhead unopposed, at exactly the wrong moment for the Japanese and exactly the right moment for history. Leading the Enterprise dive bombers of Bombing 6 and Scouting 6 was the Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to press on and keep searching when the enemy fleet was not where it was supposed to be became one of the war's great command calls. His aircraft found the Japanese carriers and tipped into their dives, and within minutes Enterprise planes had fatally struck 2 of the 4, the Kaga and the Akagi. Among those pilots was Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who holds a distinction almost unique in the history of air combat. Best scored hits on both the Kaga and the Akagi in the same battle, helping to destroy 2 carriers in a single morning, and the Navy awarded him the Navy Cross for it. His flying career ended that same year all the same. Best had breathed bad oxygen from a faulty system during the fighting, and the damage to his lungs forced his medical retirement later in 1942, which meant he had spent his own health to help win Midway. Enterprise aircraft were not finished either, contributing later that day to sinking the last of the 4 Japanese carriers, the Hiryu, and helping sink the heavy cruiser Mikuma on the 6th of June. One of the young pilots landing hit after hit was Ensign Jack Kleiss, who scored 3 separate dive-bombing hits during the battle, earned his own Navy Cross, and lived on to become the last surviving Enterprise dive-bomber pilot from Midway, dying in 2016 at the age of 100, a living thread reaching from the 21st century back to the morning the war turned. One detail says the most about the Big E's luck at Midway. Her aircraft helped sink 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, and Enterprise herself was never touched, emerging from the most important naval battle of the war without a scratch. That charmed streak would not last. The luck that carried her untouched through Midway ran dry over the Solomon Islands. As the long, grinding campaign for Guadalcanal opened across the second half of 1942, Enterprise found herself in the thick of the carrier battles fought for control of those waters. On the 24th of August, 1942, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she took her first serious wounds of the war when Japanese dive bombers landed 3 direct hits and rattled her with near misses. Those strikes killed 74 men and wounded somewhere between 90 and 95, the exact figure varying between accounts, and they tore up a 74-foot section of her flight deck. This is where the reputation for refusing to die begins to mean something real, because of what came next. Enterprise did not limp home for months on end. She steamed to Pearl Harbor, and the yard put her back together between the 10th of September and the 16th of October, 1942, barely a month in dock before she was ready to fight again. She would need to be, because the hardest single day of her war was closing in fast. On the 26th of October, 1942, Enterprise fought the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and this engagement, more than any other, cemented the legend. It also deserves to be understood honestly, because the popular version leaves out the most uncomfortable fact of all. 2 bombs struck Enterprise at Santa Cruz, killing 44 of her crew and wounding 75. Her commanding officer for the battle was Captain Osborne Hardison, who had taken the ship only days earlier, while Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid flew his flag aboard and Rear Admiral George Murray commanded the task force. During the fighting, the carrier Hornet, the same ship that had launched the Doolittle bombers, was hit again and eventually lost, and as she went out of action her aircraft had nowhere to land, so Enterprise, wounded as she was, took them aboard. By the time the guns fell silent, one stark fact stood alone. Enterprise was the last operational American aircraft carrier in the Pacific. That is the line that built the legend, and it is true. Here is the part the legend usually buries, and it matters to anyone who wants real history instead of myth. Santa Cruz was not an American victory. Naval historians who have studied the battle closely, including analysts writing for the Naval Institute, argue that Santa Cruz was, in tactical terms, a Japanese win, since the Americans lost a fleet carrier and had their only survivor damaged. The day after the battle, it was Japan, not the United States, that held the only fully operational carrier force in the Pacific. The plucky survivor story is real, and yet it rests on top of a defeat. Enterprise did not win Santa Cruz, she survived it, and survival at that particular moment was its own kind of victory, because the alternative was to have no American carrier in the Pacific at all. That condition reveals just how fragile the American position truly was. For a brief and dangerous window, the entire American carrier presence in the Pacific rested on one damaged hull. Engineers have a term for a situation exactly like this: a single point of failure, one component whose loss brings the whole system crashing down. Modern engineers pour enormous effort into designing single points of failure out of their systems, building in redundancy so that no one server, no one power line, no one part can take everything with it when it fails. In the autumn of 1942, the United States Navy in the Pacific had precisely one carrier standing, and behind her there was no redundancy at all. The whole system ran through the Big E. What stands out is not that this was a risky way to run a war. What stands out is that the ship held. It was during this stretch that Enterprise gained a legendary new air group, Air Group 10, which took the fighting name the Grim Reapers, its fighter squadron led by Lieutenant Commander James Flatley under the call sign Reaper Leader. Barely 2 weeks after Santa Cruz, with her repairs still unfinished, Enterprise was thrown straight back into the fight, and the way she went says everything about the crisis of late 1942. The naval battle of Guadalcanal unfolded across several days in the middle of November, from the 13th to the 15th. Enterprise sailed from the harbor at New Me to take part, and she sailed before she was ready, with repair crews still aboard working on her Santa Cruz damage as the ship steamed toward combat. Waiting until she was whole was not an option, because there was no one else to send. Her aircraft proved decisive anyway. On the 13th of November, planes from Enterprise helped sink the Japanese battleship High-A, one of the first enemy battleships lost in the campaign, and across the battle her aircraft were credited with helping to sink 16 Japanese ships and damage 8 more. A ship that belonged in dry dock had instead helped break a Japanese battleship force, with civilian and Navy repairmen still hammering at her wounds. That was the low point of the war for Enterprise, and it was also her finest hour, the moment the tide of American industrial power began to turn and the ship that had held the line alone became one carrier among a growing many. In 1943, Enterprise finally received the one thing 18 months of continuous combat had denied her, which was time. She came home to the United States for a major overhaul and modernization completed by October of that year, and she emerged heavier and far deadlier, her standard displacement grown to around 21,000 tons, her length stretched past 827 feet, her hull wearing a pattern of dazzle camouflage. The upgrades that mattered most were her weapons and her eyes. Dense batteries of 40mm and 20mm automatic cannon now joined her original 5-inch guns, the direct fruit of hard lessons learned at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz about what happened to a carrier that could not throw up enough fire. She also gained radar-directed fire control, which meant her guns could be aimed not just by a gunner's eye but by the invisible reach of her radar. The ship, that had survived 1942 on courage and luck, now carried the technology to survive on something far more reliable. The next chapter is one of the least known and most important, because Enterprise helped invent an entirely new way of making war, and one of the war's most famous aviators died in the process. In November of 1943, she supported the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the assault on Tarawa and Marken, and during this period she became a pioneer of night carrier operations, launching and recovering aircraft in total darkness. Landing a single-engine aircraft on a moving, blacked-out flight deck in the middle of the ocean at night, with no lights and no horizon, sat right at the outer edge of what was humanly possible. Picture what pilots do routinely today to grasp what those aircrews were attempting. A modern airliner descending through a solid overcast toward a runway it cannot see is flying on instruments, trusting a fusion of radar, radio beams, and cockpit displays instead of the eye. The Enterprise night flyers of 1943 were reaching for that same idea decades before the technology matured, flying and fighting and landing on radar and radio and raw nerve in place of the horizon they could not see, building the foundations of all-weather naval aviation in real time and in combat. On the 26th of November, 1943, one of those experimental night missions cost the Navy a hero. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, known to everyone as Butch, was killed flying from Enterprise on the Navy's first carrier-based night fighter mission, a tactic developed in large part aboard the Big E. His death is the right moment to fix a piece of history that gets garbled in countless tellings. Butch O'Hare stands among the most decorated naval aviators of the war, and Chicago's O'Hare Airport carries his name, and he earned the Medal of Honor for an action in February of 1942. He earned that medal flying from the carrier Lexington, though not Enterprise. His link to Enterprise came later, when he commanded her air group and helped pioneer her night fighting tactics, and it was in that role that he died. He was an Enterprise commander at the end, and yet the deed that made him famous belongs to another ship. Getting that right matters, because a ship with a record as genuine as the Big E's has no reason to borrow glory from anyone. By 1944, Enterprise had become one carrier inside a fast carrier force of overwhelming size, the spearhead of an American fleet that now dwarfed anything Japan could send to sea, and the desperate, lonely fighting of 1942 was over. The War of Annihilation had begun. In June, she fought in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the great carrier clash American aviators nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the one-sided destruction of Japanese air power, having supported the invasion of Saipan since the middle of the month. For months later came the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from the 23rd to the 26th of October, 1944, with Enterprise aircraft ranging across the entire fight and striking at all three of the separate Japanese forces converging on the American landings. Leyte Gulf is where her aircraft helped kill a giant. On the 24th of October, her planes joined the attacks that sank the Japanese super battleship Musashi, one of the two largest and most heavily armored battleships ever constructed. The Big E, which had already helped sink 3 carriers at Midway, could now add one of the largest battleships on Earth to her tally, until there was almost nothing afloat her air group had not, at one time or another, helped to destroy. At the end of 1944, the Navy formally recognized what Enterprise had been building toward for a year and converted her into a dedicated night carrier, changing her designation to match the mission and specializing her air group in operating around the clock while other carriers slept. That role made her one of the hardest working ships in the fleet during the campaigns of early 1945. In February, her aircraft struck the Japanese home islands directly, hitting targets around Tokyo on the 16th and 17th, before she moved to support the invasion of Iwo Jima beginning on the 19th. Over Iwo Jima, she set a record that stands as perhaps the purest measure of what a night carrier could do. Beginning on the afternoon of the 23rd of February and continuing without a single pause until the 2nd of March, 1945, Enterprise kept aircraft in the air over Iwo Jima continuously, which works out to 7 days and 6 hours, 174 hours of unbroken flight operations. Across that stretch, she launched 406 flights, an average of 50 every 24 hours, day and night, never stopping. The thing that finally halted her was not the enemy. It was the weather. A warm front rolled in on the 2nd of March, bringing heavy rain and zero visibility, and only then, when even her night flyers were blind, did the operation end. A ship holding 50 flights a day aloft for a solid week is a machine running at the absolute limit of what men and metal can bear, and Enterprise held it there. For 3 years, the Japanese Navy had thrown everything it owned at Enterprise, bombs, torpedoes, and 3 separate confident radio announcements of her destruction, and none of it had put her out of the war. What finally did was the weapon Japan reached for when almost nothing else remained: the kamikaze, the deliberate suicide crash of a piloted aircraft into an American ship. Off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the suicide planes came in waves. On the 11th of April, a kamikaze struck Enterprise while a second narrowly missed, and the damage forced her back to the anchorage at WWII for repairs. A bomb had already hit her on the 18th of March, and each time the crew patched her up and she kept coming back. The blow that ended her fighting career was still ahead, and when it landed in spectacular fashion. On the 14th of May, 1945, a single bomb-laden Zero dove on Enterprise and struck her near the forward elevator, and the explosion did something almost theatrical in its violence. It hurled the forward aircraft elevator, a steel structure weighing something like 15 tons, hundreds of feet straight up into the air. Photographs of that instant, the enormous elevator platform hanging above the ship like a flipped coin, became some of the most famous images of the naval war. The casualties from that strike are, fittingly for this ship, a matter of dispute, with the most commonly cited figures ranging from about 12 to 14 men killed and the wounded counted anywhere from 34 to more than 70, depending on the source. One thing is certain: that hit ended the combat career of the most decorated warship in American history. A haunting human coda trails the 14th of May. 4 decades the identity of the pilot who flew that final, fatal plane stayed uncertain, and the standard history of the ship, the book The Big E by Edward Stafford, recorded his name in a form that later proved to be a misreading. Years afterward, a Japanese researcher working with the Association of Enterprise Veterans established that the pilot was a young officer named Shunsuke Tomiyasu, and the men who had been on the receiving end of his attack helped put a real name and a real face to the man who had come to kill them, correcting the historical record in the process. There was one more layer to the drama of that day. Enterprise at that moment carried the flag of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, who had transferred his flag to her only days earlier after his previous flagship had itself been hit by a kamikaze. Mitcher was aboard the Big E when Tomiyasu struck, which meant the admiral commanding America's carrier striking power had now been burned off 2 flagships in a matter of days, a raw measure of how ferocious the fighting off Okinawa had become. Enterprise steamed for the Puget Sound Navy Yard and arrived on the 7th of June, 1945. Her repairs finished around the 13th of September, by which point the war was over. She never operated aircraft again. The Grey Ghost had made her last combat launch. Before following Enterprise into peacetime, the full arithmetic of her war deserves to be set down, because the totals are staggering, and they come from the Navy's own official reckoning. Across the entire war, the planes and guns of Enterprise downed 911 enemy aircraft, while her bombers sank 71 ships and damaged or destroyed another 192. Those are the official aggregate credits, and like all such figures from the confused arithmetic of carrier warfare, the precise question of who sank what is debated by historians, yet the scale is not in doubt. This one ship accounted for enemy aircraft by the hundreds and enemy ships by the dozens. The cost of that record was paid in men. According to the detailed research of the association that keeps her history, 374 men were killed in action or died in the line of duty while serving in Enterprise or her attached air groups between Pearl Harbor and the end of the war, with a further 12 taken prisoner. Of those killed, 139 came from the ship's own company, and nearly 2/3 were aircrew from her air groups, young men who flew off her deck and never came back. 1942 was the deadliest year by far, the year she stood nearly alone, claiming 224 of her men, with 70 more killed in 1944 and 60 in just the first 4.5 months of 1945. For all of that, Enterprise finished the war as the most decorated warship the conflict produced, 20 battle stars. A Presidential Unit Citation awarded in May of 1943, which made her the first aircraft carrier ever to receive that honor. A Navy Unit Commendation that made her the only carrier to hold both awards for wartime service. She also received one honor no other ship of any foreign navy has ever been given. On the 23rd of November, 1945, at Southampton in England, Enterprise was awarded the British Admiralty Pennant, the only vessel outside the Royal Navy to be so honored since that distinction was created in the 16th century. Perhaps the finest tribute came from the office of the Secretary of the Navy, who described Enterprise as the one ship that most nearly symbolizes the history of the United States Navy in the Second World War. That judgment is hard to argue with, because if you wanted to teach the entire naval war through a single hull, you would choose the Big E. Enterprise had one mission left to fly, and it turned out to be the gentlest of her career. With the war won, the Navy pressed its ships into Operation Magic Carpet, the enormous job of ferrying millions of American servicemen home across the oceans, and a carrier's cavernous hangar deck, emptied of aircraft, could hold thousands of men at a time. Enterprise brought home more than 10,000 veterans. Her first Atlantic voyage carried 4,668 servicemen out of Southampton, and on the 25th of December, 1945, she steamed into New York with 4,413 men aboard, a Christmas homecoming. On her final voyage, returning from the Azores, she carried 3,557 personnel, including 212 women of the Women's Army Corps, and arrived in New York on the 17th of January, 1946. The ship that had killed so efficiently spent her last active months as a ferry for the living, delivering tens of thousands of men back to the country that had built her in the depths of a depression. She moored at the New York Naval Shipyard on the 18th of January, 1946, to begin deactivation, and on the 17th of February, 1947, the most decorated warship in American history was decommissioned, her war and her service both over. Here is the cruel turn at the heart of this story, the one that gives the whole thing its shape. Enterprise had survived 3 years of the most intense naval combat in history, and Japan had announced her sunk 3 times and failed 3 times. She had been bombed, crashed into, and set afire, and she had always come back, which made her, by any reasonable measure, unkillable. In peacetime, a budget killed her. After the war, there was a genuine effort to preserve Enterprise as a national memorial to what the Navy had done in the Pacific. A plan to keep her as a memorial in New York existed as early as 1946, only to be suspended in 1949. The veterans who had served aboard her formed an association in 1954, held their first reunion in Chicago, and took up the cause of saving their ship, and they found a powerful champion in Admiral Halsey, who had flown his flag aboard Enterprise through the darkest early months and threw his full weight behind the effort. A joint resolution reached Congress in 1957 to establish Enterprise as a national memorial museum in Washington, and a fundraising drive even asked schoolchildren to contribute their nickels and dimes to save her. None of it raised enough. The money fell short of the sum the Navy required to release her, and the campaign collapsed. A board of inspection had already declared her unfit for further naval service in 1956. Her name was struck from the Register of Navy Ships on the 2nd of October that year, and on the 1st of July, 1958, Enterprise was sold to the Lipset Corporation and towed to New Jersey to be taken apart. By around May of 1960, the most decorated warship in the history of the United States was gone, cut up for scrap metal. Consider the shape of that outcome. The ship the Japanese Empire could not sink with bombs, torpedoes, and kamikazes was destroyed by a peacetime accounting decision, because the country she had defended would not, in the end, pay to keep her. Enterprise did not die in battle. She died because a fundraising drive came up short, and no enemy in her entire story proved more effective than that one. The loss did carry a consequence, and this is where the story bends towards something almost hopeful. The failure to save Enterprise, the most obviously deserving warship in the fleet, jolted the country into seeing what it was throwing away. A movement grew in the years that followed to preserve historic ships as museums, and it succeeded where the Enterprise campaign had failed. 4 carriers of the later Essex class, the Yorktown, the Intrepid, the Hornet, and the Lexington, along with the carrier Midway, survive today as floating museums that draw millions of visitors, and in a real sense they were saved because Enterprise was not. The Big E's final contribution to the Navy was to become the cautionary example that rescued the ships that came after her. A ship as large as Enterprise cannot be entirely erased, and pieces of her outlived the scrappers, scattered across the country like relics for anyone who wants to stand in her presence. Her ship's bell went to the United States Naval Academy in 1950, where it has hung ever since and is rung to celebrate Navy victories over Army. One of her 15-foot anchors stands in Lutz Park at the Washington Navy Yard, and her builder's commissioning plaque is held by the National Museum of the Navy. There is also the matter of her mast, which someone had promised to preserve and erect at the Naval Academy's football stadium, a promise that in the end went unkept, though a plaque still marks the spot meant to hold it, a place still called Enterprise Tower. The largest surviving piece is her stern plate, the great steel section of her transom that carried her name, saved by the engineer who directed her dismantling, a man named Henry Hoffman, who could not stomach seeing the whole ship reduced to scrap and donated it in 1959. 4 decades that stern plate stood in a memorial park in Rivervale, New Jersey. The story reaches into the present day from there. In 2025, the stern plate was entrusted to the Navy's History Command, and in October of that year it was unveiled beside the preserved battleship New Jersey in Camden as part of a national commemoration of the Navy's history. The plan now is for the stern plate of Enterprise to become a centerpiece artifact in the World War II gallery of a new National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, a museum projected to open in phases beginning around 2030 and to draw well over 1 million visitors every year. Nearly 70 years after she was cut up for scrap, the nameplate of the Big E is being set where the largest possible number of Americans will see it, and the ship the country failed to save as a whole is being honored at last in the one piece of her that mattered most, the piece that carried her name. Enterprise refused to die in one final way, and it is the way that endures, because the ship was scrapped but the name was not. In 1961, the year after the last of the old Enterprise was cut apart, the Navy commissioned a new one, built like her namesake at Newport News in Virginia, and she was something the world had never seen, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier ever built. She inherited the nickname the Big E, and at 1,123 feet she became the longest naval vessel ever constructed, serving for half a century before her inactivation in 2012 and her formal decommissioning on the 3rd of February, 2017. She waits her own turn for the breakers now, and yet her name was already promised forward, because a third Enterprise is rising at this very moment. Under construction at the Newport News shipyard, the same yard that built both her predecessors, stands a new carrier of the most modern American class, the 9th United States ship to carry the name Enterprise. 2 of her sponsors were chosen in 2016, and the choice broke with tradition in a way the Big E would have appreciated, because they are the Olympic gold medalists Simone Biles and Katie Ledecky, the first athletes and the first pair of joint sponsors ever selected for an American aircraft carrier. The first steel for this newest Enterprise was cut in August of 2017. Her keel was laid in 2022. She was floated for the first time in late 2024, and by the spring of 2026 she is more than half built. Her construction has not gone smoothly. Her delivery date has slipped again and again, and reporting from the Naval Institute in May of 2026 put the latest estimate at March of 2031, which would mean the ship took just over 12 years to build. A shipyard spokesman traced the delays to the late arrival of large, sequence-critical equipment, all of which, he noted, has since arrived, and her total estimated cost runs somewhere around $14 billion. What she is made of is what closes the circle. The newest Enterprise physically incorporates recycled steel from the nuclear carrier that came before her, and she incorporates 4 portholes taken from the original, from the Grey Ghost herself. Steel that sailed through Midway and Santa Cruz and Leda Gulf, that survived 3 announced sinkings and 1 very real kamikaze, will sail again in a ship not yet finished. Fittingly for a vessel named Enterprise, she is also the first American aircraft carrier designed and built entirely in the digital realm, without paper plans. One last piece of the legend belongs here, offered honestly as legend rather than established fact. It has long been said that when a television writer went looking for a name for a fictional starship, a vessel meant to embody exploration and courage and the refusal to back down, he reached for the name Enterprise in tribute to the carrier. Whether or not that is precisely how it happened, the instinct behind the story is sound, because if you searched all of human history for a single name that meant a thing that would not quit, you could do a great deal worse than the ship the enemy sank 3 times and could never kill once. The United States built USS Enterprise in the worst economic crisis in its history, sent her into the worst naval war in its history, and then, having asked her to survive the unsurvivable and watched her do exactly that, could not find the money to keep her. She fought in all but 2 of the major actions of the Pacific War. Her aircraft helped sink 3 carriers in a single morning at Midway and one of the largest battleships ever built at Leda Gulf. She stood as the only operational American carrier in the Pacific at the lowest point of the war, held the line with repair crews still hammering at her hull, and came home the most decorated warship her country had ever put to sea. The Japanese Navy declared her dead 3 times and was wrong 3 times, and in the end it took a bomb-laden aircraft off Okinawa to stop her from fighting, and even that did not sink her. She was killed, finally, by a fundraising shortfall and the stroke of a pen, cut up for scrap while the men who had served aboard her watched and could do nothing. The name did not go down with her. It passed to the first nuclear carrier ever built, and it is passing now to a third ship rising in that same Virginia shipyard, carrying her recycled steel and 4 of her own portholes forward into a century she will never see. The ship that refused to die was, in the end, mortal after all. The name she carried was not.